Today at shop.app.com, we're going to be upgrading the front brakes on our B8.5 S4. Okay, so before we get into our DIY on these brakes, real briefly about the parts we're installing. So we're using Girodisc. These are two-piece front rotors, and then we have G-Loc front pads. So G-Loc is a brand that's kind of more boutique brand. They make pads for generally what I would say track use, but these are going to more street use pads. This is going to be something that you'd expect more from vendors who manufacture or looking for brake pads who either track their car, because these are good pads to integrate. Because what we can do with these is take these pads, swap them out with their track pads without having issues with bedding them on your rotor. So you can use their same different pads. You can swap from a street pad to a track pad without having issues of the pad compound bedding into your rotor. So you'll still have to bed them, but there won't be issues or concerns around if you can bed two different pads on your particular rotor, which obviously most people are looking for something that they can transition between track use and street use, and you don't want to be running track pads on a car. We've had a lot of people who ask questions about it, or people who upgrade to track pads thinking that they want aggressive pads, and then they squeal nonstop under normal street conditions. That's completely normal, which is why you don't want track pads on a street car. They don't stop properly in cold temperatures until they're properly warmed up, and they will squeak, at low speed when the pads are cold. So those are two things that are generally unpleasant for street driving, which is why you want to have two different pads, which we're going to be going with the street ones. And then when we do track stuff at a later time, we'll swap over to the track pads. And then two-piece rotors is something that we'll probably shoot a separate video talking about weight differences and stuff like that. These are going to be a lower weight than what you would find with a solid one-piece rotor. You also can swap out the discs themselves with hardware. They unbolt from here. You can swap the discs out for new ones, but most importantly, they are unsprung weight, and that's why you want to cut down on it. For people who are tracking their car, they want to cut down on as much weight as possible. That's why they go with two-piece rotors. And while they are more expensive, they are a better option for people who are tracking their car. With that said, let's get into our install. Okay, so here we are on our driver's side, and we are going to be replacing the rotor and then the pad. So we have to take off the assembly here completely. If you were doing just pads, you can take off just the caliper. We will have to take off the carrier as well. Now, you can unbolt this as an assembly, but unfortunately, because you have to get the pads back into this caliper, you're better off actually taking off the caliper first and the carrier later, because the assembly gets pretty heavy, and also you can't really sneak the new pads in very easily. So what I'm going to do is actually take this. This is a spring clip. It has two legs here, and then it slides up here. So you have to kind of get it past here. You have to be careful, because this thing will pop off like that when you do it. And so all that happens is there's this spring clip sits in here, and again, it holds that together there. So that's where we're going to start. Now we go to the back side to get the caliper bolts. Okay, so we're going to start with our lower caliper bolt here. I'm also going to start by loosening, not tightening. Loosen this top one. And now we can take off our caliper. Now before we remove this caliper, we're going to talk about this brake pad wear indicator wire right here. This is what sends our sensor signal to the vehicle that your brake pads are worn. On this car, the light is off, and I think it's because this wire is broken right here. But we're going to show you right now how to take that off. And we have a kind of a pick here, and all you do is take this and kind of get it in there, and it has a tab that kind of sits it in place. You rotate that down, and you kind of wiggle it out, and then we're going to remove this electrical connection like so, and you squeeze here and you slide them apart, and now we can disconnect this caliper from the vehicle. So removing the caliper is pretty easy. We're just going to take a flathead screwdriver, and you can just rock it off. Start on one side, go to the other. Now, once we get that clear, we can rest it up there for now, but what I'm gonna do is actually take some zip ties and just run it through the caliper. Now you can use whatever method you prefer for this. I'm using zip ties because I think that a lot of people will have them around their house. And so I'm gonna take one zip tie and then I'm gonna loop it onto another zip tie, and we're gonna keep this caliper and we're gonna connect it up to this control arm here. Now this is gonna keep this out of the way and give you the ability to work while you're dealing with the rotor and the pads, so you don't have to potentially hurt yourself or damage your brake line during this process. All right, now we're clear and we can take off our carrier. Okay, so here we're gonna take the set screw off of the rotor before we take this carrier off, because you can just drop a screwdriver in there and it'll stop the thing from turning when you're breaking this thing loose. Now, what I like to do is there's a thing called a impact driver, which you can use like a bit on. That's helpful for this. You may need it, you may not need it. Actually, this one's turned right out, surprisingly, for a vehicle that has a fair amount of rust on it. It came out pretty easy. But if yours didn't come out that easy, what I would suggest you do is, if you don't have an impact driver, which you probably won't, take a bit like this, put it in there, slap it with a hammer a couple times, get some penetrating oil sprayed on there. That will help you get this out without potentially breaking it, because you don't need this set screw. Once it's in place, it does make your life a lot easier, because when you're dealing with trying to get these back on without a set screw, it's pretty miserable. So let's go ahead and take off our carrier now. Okay, so we're right here on the back of this carrier here, and here are two 21 millimeters. And so we're gonna get this on there, and you're gonna want something that's gonna be on the longer side to give you a little bit of leverage to work with. And if I should probably turn the correct direction. Do it the right way, unlike our first shot. And as you see, we must have broken it loose on our first shot. And we'll pull that carrier off. Now we gotta get our rotor off. Now, because this vehicle is from the Northeast, this rotor's not coming off. So what you do is take a wheel bolt, you stick it in there, and we're gonna beat the hell out of this with a hammer. This is a very terrible noise that it makes, and you can start by, if you care about preserving the rotor, you're gonna start by hitting the hub and focus there. Because these rotors are done anyway, you can hit it on the edges and it won't matter. But for sure, if you want to reuse these, do not hit the braking surface at all. So we're going to go ahead and just give it a couple whacks. And it's loose. Hammer time. So now we can take our pads out of your caliper. First, we're going to take a look here, because this vehicle has a brake pad wear indicator light, which is what we disconnected earlier. And we're going to take this boot off. This is a bleeder screw that kind of doubles as a wire holder. The cap for it. Watch me struggle. All right. Now, this hooks around the back here, and then you want to get this hooked around, and then this is free. You're not going to be able to take this inner pad off until you get that loose. So you want to make sure you get that done. Now we're going to flip this around the other side, and we can pop this pad out and then pull that wire through. Now we're going to take this other pad off. Now what I had on the other side was an experience where this thing is really bonded to this thing. So I had to do a lot of prying, and it looks like this side's going to be no different. So seems to be kind of adhered to this thing. All right, now we're off, and it seems like there was some adhesive on here. I don't think these are original pads. I don't see any Audi logos on there anywhere. I'm not sure if these are original pads or not, but they are off and they are pretty worn. Okay, so you can see here, inner pad This isn't the outer pad. There is a difference in the amount of pad material that's here. Again, as always, the inner pad will always wear faster than the outer pad. That's very standard. This one actually, if you can look closely here, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to show this on camera, but if you see, there are actually the rivets that are behind the pad material that are starting to, you kind of see witness marks of them. Not that this is metal to metal, but it's awfully close. So this vehicle certainly would have been very close to having an issue. Now let's talk about pad wear indicators. So this vehicle has pad wear indicators only on the one side, and all they do is snap in to this pad. So what you do is kind of pop that out. Now, because this, you can either swap them over to the old or to the new pads, or you can just take this and splice this wire together to make the light go off. You do not want to have that light constantly on. So what we're going to do, because we're going to track this car at some point too and swap the track pads, we're not going to maintain this sensor. So we're going to cut this, splice these together to prevent that light from coming on and driving me insane every day. Now we got to depress our piston here. Now this needs to go in so that you can have enough space with the new pad material to actually get the stuff onto the rotor. So we have to push this back in. Now we have kind of normal channel locks here. Normally I have really big channel locks that can get all the way around everything, but I think this is what most people will have for this job, which is normal size stuff. So what I found to be the best for this is you can flip it around like this, and there's this little ear that's on the caliper, and you can grab onto there to depress this thing. So make sure you get on the part of the ear that's the strong part, not the part that's actually unsupported, and then we can squeeze this. And it's going to take some time, and it'll slowly depress that piston in. You just got to make sure you're clear of that boot because you don't want to tear it or rip it as you're depressing this thing. Now once you feel that stop moving, then you should be all set to make sure that you're in all the way. Now you can go back in and maybe check from this angle to make sure that it's depressed all the way. Just make sure you're not grabbing onto anything like brake lines or anything like that. And then you can kind of just give it an extra squeeze. I can tell you this thing is bottomed out for sure. So we're ready to reassemble. We're going to throw our rotor on, and again, you want to make sure you line up that set screw because that will make your life extremely difficult if you do not have this. And in case yours breaks, I will link to the correct set screw in the description. We're just going to snug that up real quick. You don't need to go crazy with this thing because it's not really going to do a whole lot other than hold this on. All right, now we can put on our carrier. Now we're going to put on our carrier, and all we're going to do is slide this around back and get this bolted on. And we will link to these bolts in the description, and we'll also show you the torque spec for these bolts. And now we're going to tighten these up. All right, so now we're going to put our pads in. They have this clip on there. They snap into that piston. So we are going to take this piston and snap it in place. And that makes our life a little bit easier. Now we can cut our zip ties out. And pull these out, and we can put our pads in place here. We're going to throw these in. So because of this hump right here, this nub that sticks into the caliper here, you have to mount this in place first before you actually snap this on to the rotor. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to slide it over to clear like you might on other brake pads. So once we've done that, we can slide this on and then push this in place. Now, the one thing to note is if you have an issue with getting these pads and the caliper assembly onto this rotor, it's because you didn't push the piston in far enough. So if that's the case, you can take everything back off and work it back in place. If not, you should be able to wiggle this in place and you do have to get on top of these caliper nubs that stick right here and here for the pads. So here we're looking at this little slide here. If you're having a hard time getting this on, it's because the slide is in the way. So what you can do is just slide it back and it'll drop right in place. And the same thing goes for up top. If you're having problems with getting this to slide in place, it's likely because that's in the way, and it's super easy to just slide out of place there. And we can put our caliper bolts in. Now we can thread in our caliper bolts. And again, we will link to these as well. And we'll just thread these guys in. And if you have any problems getting them threaded in, just got to give it a little wiggle to get it lined up in place. Okay, so here we have our brake connector of what was on the pad wear indicator before. So all we did was take the 2 wires that came out of it, we cut them, we stripped them back, and then we spliced them together with the butt connector and then heat shrink it so that everything is good. And then we can just slide it in place like this and then snap it in just like it was before, and then take the electrical plug and plug that in place. Now this will make sure that we do not have a brake wear indicator light any longer on this vehicle. Okay, so we're gonna put our spring clip on. This is, I've found the easiest way to do is kind of get it centered in place here and then take 2 hands and then push it. Now this gets a little bit hard because this center clip, you have to get to clear, but then sit down. So that's really the best way that I've found that works. And get that thing, make sure that it's pulled in there tight and that it's even here. And then you're not too far in on one side because then it might pop off if that was the case. So we are all set there. We are going to put our wheels on the vehicle, but you do want to make sure anytime you do brakes on a vehicle, you've pushed that piston in. You need to go inside and pump the brakes in the car to get that piston pushed back out. This will ensure that the brakes will work when you go to stop the vehicle after putting brake pads on. There's been a ton of people, technicians and otherwise, who have done brakes on a car, forgot to pump the brakes, pulled out, and smashed into something because as soon as you push that brakes, the pedal's going to go to the floor, and then the car is not going to stop, and you're going to have a big problem. So always super, super important. Make sure you pump the brakes after you're done doing brake pads. We've now completed our front brake upgrade on our B8.5 S4. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it. You better subscribe. You better.